At 19 years old, the only thing my father's $2 billion empire left me was a black heavy-duty trash bag, a pair of wet jeans, and the sound of a deadbolt clicking shut behind me like the final word in an argument I never got to finish. I want to tell you that I handled it with dignity. I want to tell you I walked down that driveway with my head up and my jaw set and some kind of fire burning in my chest that kept me warm against the October rain. But that would be a lie. The truth is, I stood on that limestone porch for almost 3 full minutes after the door closed, staring at my own reflection in the glass. A 19-year-old kid with a garbage bag full of damp clothes, rain flattening his hair to his forehead, looking at himself like he was trying to figure out how he had arrived at this particular moment. Like if he stared long enough, the reflection would offer some kind of explanation. It didn't, so I walked. The driveway at the Lake Forest estate was a quarter-mile long, lined with oak trees that Holt Underwood had planted himself 22 years ago when he first bought the property. I had ridden my bike down that driveway 1,000 times as a kid. I had learned to drive on that driveway, and now I was walking down it in the rain with everything I owned in a bag that was already starting to tear at the left handle, and I didn't look back once. Not because I was strong, but because I was afraid that if I looked back at that house, I would fall apart completely. And falling apart on the driveway felt like something I would never recover from. Let me tell you about my father before I tell you what happened to him. Because if you want to understand everything that came after, you need to understand who Holt Underwood actually was. He built Underwood track systems from a garage in Naperville, Illinois. 22 years starting with 3 employees and a logistics software prototype that ran on a server he had bought secondhand from a bankrupt shipping company. By the time I was born, the company had 40 employees. By the time I turned 10, it had 400. By the time my father died, Underwood Track was valued at $2.3 billion and managed logistics networks for some of the largest retail operations in North America. He was by any reasonable measure a brilliant man. But the thing about my father that you will not find in any business profile, the thing that never made it into the industry coverage or the conference keynotes, was that he was constitutionally incapable of protecting himself from people who wanted to use him. Not because he was naive, he wasn't. He had negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars and never once been outmaneuvered in a boardroom. What he could not negotiate was his own heart. I will give you a single example because it says everything you need to know about him. When I was 16, a private equity firm approached my father with an acquisition offer. $900 million cash for a company he had spent over 2 decades building from nothing. Most people in his position would have taken it without a second thought. He turned it down. I asked him why sitting at the kitchen table the night after the meeting. He was quiet for a long moment, the way he got quiet when he was thinking about something that genuinely mattered to him. Then he said, "There are 238 people in that building who have been with me for more than 10 years. If I sell 6 months later, at least half of them are gone. I am not interested in $900 million if the cost is 238 people who trusted me." That was Holt Underwood. And that quality, that absolute inability to protect himself from the people who relied on him, was also the doorway through which Audra Tilford walked. She came into our lives 5 years before he died when I was 14, and my mother had already been gone for 3 years. Audra was 41 at the time, a former corporate consultant with credentials from 3 different firms, and a smile that arrived slightly before her eyes did, as if the 2 parts of her face were operating on a small delay. She was composed in the precise way that people are composed when composure is something they have worked very hard to construct. My father fell in love with her in about 4 months. They were married in 7. I didn't trust her from the beginning, but I was 14 years old and grieving, and not in a position to articulate why. There was nothing I could point to specifically. She was polite to me. She made my father laugh. She didn't try too hard to replace my mother, which looking back was almost certainly a deliberate calculation rather than genuine sensitivity. But there was one thing she did in the first month after she moved into our house that I noticed and filed away without knowing what to do with it, the way you file away a crack in a foundation wall and tell yourself you'll deal with it later. She changed the emergency contact number in my father's medical records. I only found out because I happened to be in the kitchen when the call came from his cardiologist's office confirming the update. Dr. Harrison, the family physician who had treated my father for 15 years, was removed from the file and replaced by a name I had never heard. A Dr. Philip Crane. When I mentioned it to my father that evening, he said Audra had suggested that Dr. Crane was better suited to his specific cardiac profile and that it made sense to consolidate his care. He seemed entirely satisfied with that explanation. I was 14. I didn't have the vocabulary to explain why it unsettled me, so I let it go. I should not have let it go. But I was 14 and Audra was careful and my father was in love, and some things only become legible when it is already far too late to act on them. The rain in Lake Forest in late October has a specific weight to it. It doesn't so much fall as accumulate, working its way through the collar of your jacket, settling into your sleeves, making everything heavier by degrees, until you realize you've been carrying extra weight so long, you've forgotten what it felt like to be dry. I was thinking about that as I walked down the driveway, the trash bag swinging against my left leg, the oak trees my father had planted, dripping cold water onto the shoulders of a coat that was not waterproof. I reached the end of the driveway and turned left onto the street without stopping. I had nowhere to go. I knew I had nowhere to go. The $10,000 that Holden Quillen had told me was tied up in probate proceedings was the only money I was technically owed, and I had already been informed it could take 12 to 18 months to clear. My bank account held $114. My car, a 2008 Honda Civic with a cracked rear bumper and a heating system that operated on its own unpredictable schedule, was parked 3 blocks away where I had left it the night before. I want to tell you something about the minutes just before the door closed, because I have thought about them more than any other single moment in this story. Audra had come to the door with Beckett beside her, and she had opened it exactly the width her shoulder required. Not wide enough for me to push through, not narrow enough to suggest she was afraid, just the precise width of someone who has measured the encounter in advance and knows where every edge is. She had said, "You are 19, Mercer, an adult under the law. Your father is gone, and this estate passed to me in accordance with his clearly documented wishes. I think on some level you have always known this day was coming." I said, "He called me 4 weeks ago. He said he needed to see me." She said, "He was not well toward the end. You know that as well as anyone. Grief does things to memory, and I understand that this is an extraordinarily painful time for you." Beckett said nothing. He stood with his arms folded loosely and looked at a point somewhere above my left shoulder and maintained the expression of someone who has been told in advance that this conversation would happen and has rehearsed his non-participation in it. I said, "I grew up in this house." Audra said, "I know, and I am genuinely sorry for the difficulty of this transition, but sentiment and property law are separate categories, and the law is very clear about where things stand." She paused. "If you attempt to enter the property again without permission, I will contact the authorities. Holden has been very thorough in making sure our legal position is airtight." She said Holden's name the way you say the name of a tool you are confident in, not with affection, with the satisfaction of someone who has the right implement for the job. Then she closed the door. The deadbolt engaged, and Beckett Tilford, 22 years old and educated on my father's money and wearing a sweater that had probably cost more than my monthly food budget, turned away from the glass without looking at me once. I thought about Holden Quillen as I walked toward the Civic. Holden had been my father's attorney for 15 years. He had attended my Little League games. He had sat at our Thanksgiving table so many times that I thought of his seat as his seat, the chair on the left side with the slightly uneven leg that my father kept meaning to fix and never did. He had drafted the original will, the real one, the document that Holt had written when I was 12, and that left the company, the estate, and the liquid assets to me through a graduated trust structure he had spent months designing. That will had apparently been superseded by a new document executed 3 weeks before my father's death that left everything to Audra. I had been in the room when Holden read it aloud. I had watched his eyes as he announced the terms. He hadn't looked at me once. Not once. He kept his gaze fixed on the legal pad in front of him, reading the language of my dispossession in the same flat professional tone a pharmacist uses to recite dosage instructions. There were 4 people in the room. Holden, Audra Beckett, and me, the attorney and the 2 people who would benefit from the reading and the 1 person who would not. The power arrangement of that room was so obvious and so complete that it would have felt theatrical if it had not been so thoroughly real. Audra sat with her hands folded on the table and her expression arranged into something that communicated grief without committing to any of its specifics. Beckett sat beside her and examined his phone with the focus of someone performing a task they have been told is important. Neither of them said anything during the reading. Neither of them needed to. The reading said everything that needed to be said. The estate, the company, the liquid assets, the offshore accounts, all of it to Audra Tilford Underwood in recognition of her status as Holt Underwood's surviving spouse and in accordance with his clearly documented final wishes. I received a single payment of $10,000 described in the document as a gesture of goodwill and acknowledgement of the personal relationship between the testator and his son. A gesture of goodwill. I had grown up in that house. I had watched my father build that company from a garage in Naperville. I had been there for 20 years of it, for the lean years and the years of acceleration and the years when the company was large enough that my father worried it had grown past the point where he could still know every person in the building by name. A gesture of goodwill and $10,000 tied up in probate. I looked at Holden when he finished reading. He had set the legal pad down and was straightening it against the edge of the table with the care of a man who finds comfort in small, precise adjustments to the physical world. He did not look up. I watched him straighten that legal pad and understood that he was not going to look at me, and that the not looking was as deliberate as everything else in this room. But here is the thing, I keep returning to the thing that made it worse than if he had simply been a stranger doing his job. Holden did not avoid my eyes. That is what I had expected. That is what a guilty man does. A guilty man avoids the thing that makes him feel guilty. Holden looked directly at me in the hallway before the reading began. I had stopped him, put my hand on his arm and said, "He called me 4 weeks before he died. He said he needed to talk to me about something he needed to arrange. What was he trying to tell me?" And Holden had looked me straight in the eye, had placed his hand on my shoulder with the gentle, firm pressure of someone setting a lid on something they want to keep contained, and said, "Your father loved you very much, Mercer. That never changed. But he was also very clear about his wishes. The documents speak for themselves. Clear, steady, unblinking. That was worse than anything else. Because a man who looks you in the eye while he says something like that has already made peace with what he is. He is not struggling against it. He has decided the deciding is done, and now it is simply a matter of holding the surface steady. I reached the Civic and got in. The seat was cold. I sat with both hands on the wheel and the key not yet in the ignition, watching the rain trace crooked paths down the windshield. Then I drove to the nearest Walmart and parked in the far back corner of the lot, and that was where I lived for the next 3 weeks. The first 4 days were the simplest in a terrible way. I was furious at Audra. She was the obvious target, the clear architect, the woman who had spent 5 years positioning herself inside my father's life, and then at the moment of maximum advantage, pulled the entire structure down on top of me. The anger was clean, and it kept me functioning in a way the Civic's heater could not. But sustained fury costs energy, and when you are rationing crackers and peanut butter and sleeping in the backseat of a car with the windows frosting over from your own breath, energy is a resource you cannot afford to spend recklessly. By the second week, the anger had consumed itself, and underneath it was something much harder to deal with. A question, not about Audra, about my father. If Holt Underwood knew something was wrong, if he had called me 4 weeks before his death to say he needed to arrange something, then why hadn't he simply told me? Why the secrecy? Why leave me with nothing, completely exposed, with only a phone call I couldn't prove and $114 in a car I lived in? If he trusted me enough to want to protect me, why hadn't he trusted me enough to warn me plainly? That question was more corrosive than anything Audra had done. Because Audra was the enemy, and I knew how to orient myself toward enemies. But this question was about my father, about whether his silence had been strategy or something more painful, and they didn't know how to feel about any of the possible answers. Every path through that question led somewhere I wasn't sure I could come back from. That was the thing that sat in the passenger seat of the Civic at 3 in the morning and asked itself without answering. Not the eviction, not the cold, not the crackers or the frosted windows, or the humiliation of brushing my teeth in a Walmart restroom before dawn. The question about my father's silence. That was the one that came closest to breaking me. On the 11th night, I borrowed the Wi-Fi signal from a gas station 2 blocks from the parking lot and searched my father's name on my phone. The usual results came back. Business coverage, industry profiles, a piece from 2 years ago about Underwood Track's expansion into the Southeast. And then near the bottom of the page, A short item from the Chicago Tribune. 140 words. Holt Underwood, founder and CEO of Underwood Track Systems, had died at 61 from coronary failure. No unusual circumstances were noted. The company had released a brief statement. The byline read Patricia Walsh. I clicked the name. The author profile page loaded, then showed a single line of text. This account has been removed. I sat with the phone in my hands for a long time, the gas station fluorescence buzzing somewhere behind the screen's glow. The article still existed. The content was still there. But the person who wrote it had been erased from the system so thoroughly that even the automated archive couldn't locate her. That is a specific kind of removal. It does not happen because a journalist changes jobs. Someone had reached into the Tribune's content system and deleted a reporter's entire professional existence while leaving her article in place as if the words had generated themselves. I saved screenshots of both the article and the blank author page and stared at them for a while. And then I thought something I had not allowed myself to think in 11 days of cold and hunger and circular grief. If something was important enough to erase a journalist from a newspaper's records, then something real was being protected. And if something real was being protected, my father might have known about it. And if he had known, then his silence wasn't confusion or weakness. It was the same instinct that had made him turn down $900 million to protect the people who depended on him. He had been building something, and he hadn't been able to tell me what it was before it was finished. I chose sitting in that gas station parking lot on the 11th night to believe that version. Not because it was comfortable, but because the other version, the one where my father had simply failed me, was a version I couldn't build anything on. And I needed something I could build on. I drove back to the Walmart lot. 6 nights later, on the 17th night, I opened the tackle box. I had grabbed it on my way out of my father's study, almost by pure reflex, when the security guard's hand was already on my arm, and I had maybe 12 seconds to take one thing from the room before being walked out. The guard wore the badge of a private security company called Sentinel, a name I had never seen before in that house, a company that had not been part of my father's household 3 months ago. He watched me pick up the tackle box with the expression of someone deciding whether to object. I held it up. He let it pass. It was a green metal tackle box dented at one corner with a handle wrapped in black electrical tape that my father had applied sometime in the mid-90s and never replaced. It had been on the floor of the Civic's back seat for 3 weeks, and I had not opened it because opening it felt like something I was not ready for. On the 17th night, I was ready. I climbed into the back seat, set the box in my lap, and undid the 2 latches. The hinges resisted slightly the protest of old metal. The smell came out: first lake water, old rubber, rust, a faint trace of motor oil from fishing trips to Lake Michigan, when I was young enough to believe that catching one small bass was the finest possible way to spend a Saturday morning. I sat with the box open and my eyes closed for a moment, just holding that smell in my lungs. Then I ran my fingers over the plastic dividers, the dried-out rubber worms, the rusted hooks in their small compartments, the tangled lengths of fishing line that my father had always meant to unsnarl and never had. I was near the bottom of the tray when I pressed down and felt something shift. I went absolutely still. I pressed again. The bottom of the tray gave with a soft, precise click, the sound of something engineered to release cleanly, rather than the random give of warped plastic. A false bottom. My hands were shaking as I wedged my car key under the edge and pried upward. The tray lifted cleanly, and beneath it, resting on the dark green plastic of the box's actual floor, were 2 things. A small velvet pouch, the kind jewelry comes in, and a folded piece of yellow legal paper. I unfolded the paper with both hands. The handwriting was my father's, but barely. The letters were rushed, uneven, slanting hard to the right in a way I had never seen from him. Holt Underwood had been a precise, deliberate writer. Whatever had produced this was the work of someone fighting against something. It said, "Mercer, if you are reading this, the worst has happened the way I feared it would. Do not trust Holden Quillen. Audra and he have been working against me for months. My medication makes my thinking too clouded to fight them through normal channels. I know what they are doing to the legal documents. I do not have much time. I left you nothing on paper because she would find a way to take it. Go to First National Bank in downtown Chicago, box 402. Use this. Look up Mercer. I love you. Dad." I dumped the velvet pouch into my palm. Out slid a key, silver small, the kind made for a safety deposit box. I sat in the back seat of that Civic in the far corner of a Walmart parking lot and read my father's letter 3 more times. On the 4th reading, I noticed that the handwriting had deteriorated significantly by the last 2 lines, as if the act of writing had been costing him something he was nearly out of. Look up! I didn't know what that meant yet, but I knew that Holt Underwood had hidden a key in a false bottom inside a tackle box that he had positioned in his study in a place where I might be able to grab it during an eviction he had apparently anticipated. He had opened a safety deposit box under a name I didn't recognize. He had named 2 specific people by name in a warning written for me. This was not the behavior of a man whose mind had failed him. This was the behavior of a man who had understood exactly what was coming and had used whatever clarity remained to him to build a path out of it for the person he loved most. I sat with that understanding for a long time. Outside, the parking lot was quiet under its yellow security lights. Then I put the key in my jacket pocket, climbed back into the front seat, and did not sleep. In the morning, I pawned the fishing reels from the bottom of the tackle box at a shop 2 miles away. The man behind the counter offered me $80 without looking up. I took it, filled the Civic's tank, bought a loaf of bread, and drove into the city. The First National Bank's downtown Chicago branch occupied the ground floor of a building on West Jackson with marble floors in the kind of deliberate quiet that institutions maintain when they want you to feel the weight of your own business. I walked in wearing 3-day stubble and clothes I had slept in and waited at the information desk until a woman named Joellen Van Hook came to speak with me. She was in her early 50s, efficient in the way of someone who had worked in the same institution for decades, and she looked at me the way you look at something that has appeared where it does not clearly belong. She called security over before I had finished explaining myself. The guard stood 6 feet away while she entered my name and driver's license number into the system. Then she went very still. She typed something else, read what came back, typed again. The guard stayed where he was, but Joellen Van Hook's posture changed in a way that was difficult to articulate precisely, but unmistakable to witness. She looked at my ID again, then at the screen, then back at me. She said, "Please follow me." In the elevator going down to the vault level with the guard now conspicuously absent, she said nothing for most of the descent. Then as the doors were opening, she said it quietly, as if she had been holding it for a while and had decided now was the right moment. "Your father left instructions. If someone matching your description came in with that identification, I was to ask no further questions and bring them directly to the box. He said you would come when you were ready. That was 6 months ago." The vault room was small and private, a mahogany table under a single overhead light. She brought out the long metal box, set it on the table in front of me, and left without being asked. I put the silver key in the lock and turned it. Inside the box, there was no cash. There were no valuables of any kind. There was a single manila folder. I opened it. The first document was a property deed registered to a limited liability company called Blue Heron Holdings. Attached to it was a notarized certificate naming me as the sole proprietor of the LLC. A separate document explained that the ownership structure had been designed specifically to insulate the asset from personal probate searches. Audra's lawyers would have been searching for real estate held in my father's name. They would not have been looking for a company registered to a 19-year-old they had just thrown out of the house. The property was located in Black River Falls, Wisconsin, a rural area in the central part of the state. My father had never mentioned it to me. Also in the folder was a small brass key with a strip of masking tape on it. In my father's handwriting, 3 words, "front door." I sat with the folder open on the mahogany table and looked at the deed for a long time. A hidden property in a Wisconsin forest held through a shell company reachable only through a safety deposit box that no one outside this bank knew existed. My father had not been losing himself in those final months. He had been building a labyrinth, and he had built it with me, specifically in mind, as the person who would walk through it. I closed the folder, put it under my arm, thanked Joellen Van Hook when I passed her desk, and walked back out into the Chicago afternoon. The sky was the color of old concrete, and the wind off the lake moved through every layer I was wearing. I had $80, half a tank of gas, a loaf of bread, and a property address in Wisconsin I had never heard of. I got in the Civic and pointed north. The drive to Black River Falls took 5 hours, and for most of it, I did not turn on the radio. There was nothing I wanted to hear. No music that would have fit what I was feeling, which was not exactly fear and not exactly hope, but something that existed in the corridor between the two, where neither one has settled into anything nameable yet. I drove north through the flat suburban reach of the Illinois border, then up through the Wisconsin countryside as the land began to lift and the trees began to thicken, and by the time I crossed into the central part of the state, the pine forest had closed in on both sides of the highway like something deliberate. The sky had been gray since Chicago. By the time I reached the county highways, it had gone the color of iron low, impressing the kind of sky that has already made its decision about the day and is not interested in debate. I stopped once not for gas, but because the GPS was routing me onto a county road I couldn't read clearly on the small screen, and I needed to check the actual map. That was when I noticed the gas station on the left side of the road and the hand-painted sign above it, Ellsworth's General Store, established 1987. The parking lot held 2 pickup trucks and a propane tank that had weathered several hard winters without being replaced. I almost didn't stop. I had enough gas to reach the coordinates and enough bread for the evening. But something about the way that building sat there solid and unhurried and completely indifferent to everything I was carrying made me pull in. The woman behind the counter was in her late 50s with silver hair pulled back plainly and eyes that had the particular quality of someone who has spent decades reading the faces of people passing through and no longer needs much time to form a working assessment. She looked at my Illinois plates through the window before I came in. She looked at my face when I pushed through the door. Then she said, without asking anything first, "You are Holt Underwood's boy." I stopped walking. It was not a question. It had the flat certainty of someone confirming something they have been expecting. I said, "How do you know that?" She looked at me for a moment longer, then reached under the counter and brought out a sealed envelope. She set it between us on the glass countertop. "Your father came through here 7 months ago," she said. "He sat at that table by the window for close to 2 hours. He had coffee and didn't talk much. Before he left, he gave me this envelope and asked me to hold it until someone came in with Illinois plates asking about the logging road off County Road H. He said it would be a young man around 19 and that I would recognize him." She pushed the envelope toward me. "He was right. You look just like the photograph he left with me. My father had been here 7 months ago when by all outward appearances he was a man whose health was declining and whose household was being quietly dismantled around him. He had driven to Black River Falls, Wisconsin, sat in a general store by a window for 2 hours, and arranged with a stranger to hold an envelope for a son who hadn't come yet and might not come for months." I opened the envelope. The note inside was in my father's handwriting, but steadier than the letter in the tackle box, which told me he had written this one earlier when more of him was still intact. It said, "Do not leave the headlights on when you park. Use your phone light at the lowest setting. No flashlight. They watch for light." I read it twice. Then I looked up at Blythe Ellsworth. "Who is they?" I asked. She folded her hands on the counter. "I cannot tell you specifically, but I can tell you that 4 days ago, a black SUV with tinted windows sat in my parking lot for about 20 minutes. 2 men. They asked about the logging road off County Road H. They had the coordinates pulled up on a phone. I told them I didn't know that area well and couldn't help them." She let that sit before she continued. "They were there before you, son. Whatever your father left up on that road, someone else has already gone looking for it." I stood there with a note in my hand and understood something that changed the shape of what I thought I was walking into. This was not a retrieval. It was a race I had not known I was running, and I was already 4 days behind. I said, "I need to call the police." Blythe Ellsworth's expression didn't shift dramatically, but something in it became more precise. "Detective Elspeth Merriweather runs the local force out here. She bought a Range Rover 6 months ago. Cash. I have lived in Black River Falls for 30 years, and I know what that salary looks like." She paused. "I am not telling you not to call anyone. I am telling you not to call anyone local." I put the note in my jacket pocket and thanked her and went back to the Civic. I sat in the parking lot for several minutes doing the arithmetic of what I knew. Someone had sent 2 men to find the logging road 4 days ago. They had the coordinates, which meant they had traced the LLC or found some record of Blue Heron Holdings. They had already been to the property, and the local law enforcement was, by Blythe Ellsworth's account, not a reliable option. My father had known the local situation would be compromised. He had told me in his letter to go to the bank, not a lawyer. He had told me to go to the FBI, not to anyone else. He had planned every step of this path for the precise landscape he knew I would be navigating. I put the car in drive and followed the GPS onto County Road H. The logging road was 3 miles past the county highway, unmarked, surfaced with packed gravel that had broken down in places into bare mud and standing water. The Civic's undercarriage scraped twice in the first quarter mile. By the time I had gone a full mile, the pine branches on either side were close enough to brush the mirrors, and the road had narrowed to something that seemed designed for vehicles considerably more capable than mine. I drove without headlights the moment I turned onto the logging road, using only the running lights and the GPS on my phone. My father had said they watch for light. I had learned enough in the past hour to take his warning seriously. The trees opened after 3 miles. The clearing was roughly an acre, ringed on all sides by pine and oak, the ground covered in wet leaves that had been composting since last autumn. In the center of the clearing stood the house. I want to be honest about my first reaction because it matters for what comes after. I was disappointed, genuinely and deeply disappointed. Whatever I had been constructing in my imagination during the 5-hour drive north, whatever version of a destination hope had assembled, while logic wasn't paying attention, it was not this. The house was a 2-story A-frame with wood siding that had been white once and was now a patchy, peeling approximation of white. One of the upper windows was boarded over with plywood. The porch roof sagged in the middle in a way that suggested the supporting post had given out some years ago and no one had been there to notice. The whole structure had the particular exhaustion of a building that has been ignored long enough that it has stopped expecting anything to change. I parked the Civic at the far edge of the clearing, cut the engine, and sat in the dark for 5 minutes, listening. Rain on the roof, wind in the pines, nothing else. I got out. The wet leaves gave under my boots. The cold hit immediately, the specific cold of a Wisconsin forest in October that has been absorbing rain all day and returns it to you as a dampness with no direction and no end. The brass key from the folder fit the front door's deadbolt. The door itself had swollen in the frame from moisture and needed a shoulder to shift, resisting with the groan of wood that has not moved in some time. I pushed through into the dark interior. The smell came first dust and mildew and sealed up air. The smell of a space that has been holding itself closed for a long time. I pulled my phone out and activated the screen at its lowest setting. The living room came into focus in pieces. Furniture under white canvas drop cloths yellowed with age. A stone fireplace with a rusted grate. Hardwood floors under a layer of dust so thick and even it looked almost intentional. Almost. I swept the phone light across the floor. My footprints in the dust were clear of the flat tread of cheap sneakers from the doorway. But running through the center of the room toward the back hallway was a second set of prints. Larger, the deep, orderly pattern of a substantial boot sole engineered for grip rather than appearance. The edges of the displaced dust were still sharp. These were not old prints. I followed them into the study. The room had been searched. The canvas sheet over the heavy oak desk had been pulled off and left in a pile. The desk drawers were open, their contents scattered: old paper, empty folders, dried pens, loose coins that had been swept to the side. The bookshelf had been checked behind. The wall paneling had been tapped in, at least 2 places, small dents in the wood where someone had used a tool to test for hollow space. I stood in the doorway and read what the search was telling me. This was not a random person after valuables. The drawers had been opened and dismissed quickly. The walls had been checked. The papers had been sorted, not simply thrown. Someone had come in knowing the category of thing they were looking for. Documents, hidden compartments, something not at eye level. They had not found it. If they had found it, they would not have left the room in this condition. People who find what they came for do not leave frustrated evidence behind. They take it and go. They had missed something. I stood still in the ruined study and let my father's words come back to me from the letter in the tackle box. Look up Mercer. I raised the phone light to the ceiling of the study. Ordinary drywall, flat and featureless. Nothing. I followed the boot prints back into the hallway and up the stairs, moving close to the wall where the boards were less likely to flex, placing my weight slowly on each step. The second floor had 2 doors, a bathroom small and empty, a bedroom. The boot prints went into the bedroom, circled it completely, stopped at the closet and headed back out toward the stairs. Whoever had made them had looked inside the closet and moved on. I went into the bedroom, bare a mattress on the floor and the closet standing open at the angle someone leaves a door when they've checked inside and found nothing of interest. I walked into the closet. The air changed immediately. Colder with a thin draft coming from somewhere above me, deliberate rather than accidental. I stood still and let the draft locate itself. Look up. I raised my phone. The closet ceiling was covered in acoustic tiles, the cheap foam and cardboard kind, used in office drop ceilings in the 1980s, and never replaced because nothing in this room had been touched in decades. Gray with age, slightly uneven, the way ceilings settle when a building has shifted. Except one. In the far back corner, directly above a built-in wooden shelf, one tile sat a fraction of an inch off center. Not visibly unless you were looking. The gap on the left side was slightly wider than the butt on the right side, and through that gap, there was not the dull shadow of a standard drop ceiling cavity. There was pure black. I climbed onto the wooden shelf, testing it with one hand first. The wood held. I stood up on it, put both palms flat against the acoustic tile and pushed. It lifted easily, sliding aside with a dry scrape and a cascade of grit and insulation dust that fell into my face and triggered a coughing fit I muffled into my jacket collar because the house felt like a place where sounds traveled. When I could see again, I raised the phone. Through the hole in the ceiling, folded against the framing, was an aluminum drop-down ladder. The intruder had looked in the closet. They had not looked up. My father had known they wouldn't. He had understood exactly how people search a room, and he had understood that most people, even thorough ones, move at eye level. Looking up is not a reflex. It is something you have to train yourself to do, or something someone you trust has to remind you of. The way my father had reminded me once on a dock in Lake Michigan when I was 14 years old. I grabbed the bottom rung of the ladder and pulled. It extended with a series of loud metallic clanks that rang through the silent house like sounds that could not be recalled. I froze after each one and listened. Nothing came back from below, nothing from outside, just the rain on the roof and the wind in the pines. I climbed. The attic ran the full length of the house. The plywood floor was solid underfoot. The air was dense with cedar and old paper and the particular stillness of a space that has not been breathed in for years. I stood at the top of the ladder and swept the phone light left, then right, then into the far corners. Empty. Empty. 2 cardboard boxes near the near wall. Empty. Then the far corner. The light caught it and reflected back hard and cold and clean. It was a safe, not the kind you mount in a wall. This was 6 feet tall and proportionally wide-brushed stainless steel with a heavy wheel handle and a digital keypad bolted directly into the load-bearing beams of the attic with hardware that meant it was going nowhere short of demolishing the house around it. I walked toward it across the plywood, and as I got close enough to see the detail, my stomach went cold. The digital keypad had been destroyed. The plastic housing was shattered. The wiring behind it hung loose and dead. Around the lock mechanism, the steel bore deep, blackened gouges, the kind left by an angle grinder working at something it cannot defeat. Someone had attacked this safe with serious equipment and had failed to open it. They had found the attic, they had found the safe, and they had not been able to get inside. I sank to my knees on the plywood in front of 6 feet of steel and felt something I did not have a precise word for. The sensation of having run as far as a body can run and arriving at the finish to find it has been relocated. I stared at the destroyed keypad. Then I saw the note. A small rectangle of white paper, a standard office sticky note fixed to the side of the safe next to the ruined keypad. The edges were pristine. The handwriting was my father's. It said, "Mercer, if the keypad is broken, look behind the panel." I did not move for several seconds. Then I took out the small folding knife from my jeans pocket and wedged the blade behind the shattered plastic housing. I pried. The housing came away with a sharp snap, and the pieces scattered across the plywood. Behind the housing flush with the steel of the safe's body was a keyhole, round, mechanical, perfectly preserved. The kind that does not care about power failures or angle grinders or the destruction of everything around it, because it functions entirely on the relationship between 2 pieces of machined metal. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the silver key from First National Bank. Joellen Van Hook had not asked for it back. At the time, I hadn't thought about it. Now I understood that she hadn't asked for it back because my father had told her not to. I stood in front of the keyhole for a moment before putting the key in. Not because I was afraid of what was inside, but because I was aware, in a way I had not been aware of anything in 3 weeks of numb forward motion, that I was standing at the exact point my father had been building toward for the last months of his life. Everything he had done, the LLC, the bank, the envelope with Blythe Ellsworth, the note in the tackle box, the sticky note on the destroyed keypad, all of it had been pointing here, to this keyhole, to this key, to this moment. I thought about him at 61 years old driving up that logging road alone with a failing heart and a mind being clouded by poison, carrying this safe and the equipment to bolt it into the attic beams. Carrying it up those stairs, setting it in the corner of a room he knew no one would think to check, writing the sticky note on a piece of paper the size of a thumb, and pressing it to the steel next to the keypad he knew might be destroyed. He had done all of that for me. I slid the key into the keyhole. It went in without resistance. I turned it. The sound that came from inside the safe was deep and mechanical and definitive. The sound of heavy bolts drawing back from positions they had held for years. Then silence. I grabbed the wheel handle with both hands, braced my boots against the plywood, and pulled. The door swung open. The beam of my phone light entered the interior of the safe, and I had to put one hand against the steel body to stay upright. The bottom shelf held money. Stacks of it shrink-wrapped in clear plastic bricks of $100 bills, arranged with the same methodical attention my father brought to everything. Next to the cash sat 3 velvet pouches, heavy in a way that fabric should not be heavy, and when I lifted one and felt the solid cold weight of it, I understood without opening it that these were gold coins. But my father had not built a labyrinth to leave me money. The middle shelf held 3 things. A journal with a black leather cover thick with pages that had been written on nearly every one. 2 small external hard drives, matte black, roughly the size of a deck of cards labeled C1 and C2 in my father's handwriting, and a thick manila envelope sealed with tape with a single word written on the front in Holt Underwood's unmistakable hand. Checkmate. I set the phone on the shelf to keep the light steady and picked up the envelope with both hands. My hands were shaking. I noticed that and could not stop it. I pulled the tape and opened the envelope. The first document was a will. It was dated 5 days before my father's death. Witnessed by 3 signatures I did not recognize, notarized with a seal from a notary public in a town 40 miles from Lake Forest. It was explicit and legally unambiguous. Everything Holt Underwood owned, the company, the real estate, the liquid assets, the offshore accounts. Everything passed to me to him. Audra Tilford Underwood received nothing. Beckett Tilford received nothing. The document cited specifically in language a careful lawyer had drafted irreconcilable breaches of trust and documented evidence of conspiracy. My father had known. He had known, and he had written it down and signed it in front of witnesses while he still could, and then sealed it inside a safe where Audra's attorneys could not find it. The second document was thinner. A cover sheet from a forensic analysis laboratory in Zurich, Switzerland, a firm called MedForensic Edu, followed by 12 pages of technical findings that I read 3 times in the attic of a rotting Wisconsin cabin in the rain. The analysis examined medication samples, specifically the heart medication that Holt Underwood had been prescribed for the previous 3 years by a cardiologist named Dr. Philip Crane, the physician whose name Audra had placed in my father's medical file in that first month after she moved into our house. The medication had been replaced, not with something that simply didn't work, with a synthetic amphetamine compound engineered to push cardiac output past the threshold a compromised heart could sustain. The effect accumulated gradually over months, pushing the heart incrementally toward failure, while leaving no signature detectable in standard toxicological screening. You would need to know exactly what you were testing for with the right equipment to find it at all. My father's heart had not failed on its own. He had been killed 1 substituted dose at a time over 8 months. Attached to the toxicology report was a stack of printed emails. Audra Tilford Underwood, Holden Quillen, a private nurse named Cheryl Voss who had been on the household medical staff at the Lake Forest estate, and the financial transfers, account numbers, amounts, dates, money moving from a numbered account Audra controlled to accounts I did not recognize, timed to match the dosage schedule across 8 months. The nurse had been paid, the doctor had authorized the prescriptions, the medication had been altered at the point of delivery. I sat down on the plywood floor of the attic with the papers in my hands and tried to breathe steadily. I had known something was wrong for 3 weeks, living in a car and eating crackers and watching a journalist's professional existence disappear from a newspaper's database. I had chosen to believe my father over the evidence of the legal documents because the legal documents bore the fingerprints of corruption throughout them. But knowing something is wrong and reading the technical documentation of exactly how the person who raised you was killed are not the same experience. I sat with that for 90 seconds. I counted. It felt necessary to give it precisely that much time and not more because I could feel somewhere at the edge of the moment that if I gave it more time than that, I would not be able to keep moving. Then I heard it. Tires on gravel, slow and deliberate coming up the logging road. I switched my phone off instantly. Total darkness. I moved on memory to the small, circular ventilation window at the gable end of the attic. I found it by touch and cleared the grime from the glass with the heel of my hand and looked down into the clearing. A black SUV had parked directly behind the Civic, blocking it completely. The headlights stayed on, cutting through the rain and the dark and throwing the front porch into harsh relief. The driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was large and broad and moved with the economy of someone who has learned from experience that wasted motion creates risk. He wore a dark trench coat and boots with deep tactical treads. I had seen those tread patterns before pressed into the dust of the study floor below. This was the man who had been here 4 days ago. He had come back. Then the passenger door opened. The man who saw him now was in his early 60s, silver-haired, wearing a trench coat that had clearly been made to his specific measurements. He carried an umbrella which he opened with the unhurried precision of someone for whom being inconvenienced by weather is a matter of personal choice. I had eaten at his Thanksgiving table. I had known him since I was 8 years old. I had tried to tell him in a hospital corridor 2 weeks after my father's death that something was wrong, and he had put his hand on my shoulder and looked me in the eyes. Holden Quillen. The large man's voice carried clearly through the wet silence of the forest. The kid's car is here. He found the deed. Holden looked at the house with the expression of someone reviewing a development that is inconvenient but not entirely unexpected. When he spoke, his voice had none of the warmth that had accompanied every version of it I had ever known at any Thanksgiving, at any Little League game, in any conference room, where my father's interests were allegedly being represented. He is inside. Find him, Lawson. If he has seen what is in that safe, he does not leave these woods. Make it look like a break-in gone wrong. I was 19 years old, crouching in a black attic with my dead father's evidence of his own murder in my hands, and the man who had eaten at our table for 15 years had just ordered my death 40 feet below me. I thought about the 90 seconds I had given myself. I thought about the fact that I had already used them. I opened the backpack I had carried in from the car. I put in the money, the gold, the hard drives, the journal, the toxicology report, the real will. I zipped it closed and wore it strapped to my chest rather than my back, with the weight pressing against my sternum and my back free. Below me, the front door of the house gave way under someone's boot. I was out of time. The louvers were rotten all the way through. I learned that when I kicked them. I had positioned myself on my back on the attic floor with both knees pulled to my chest, and I drove both boots into the wooden slats with everything my body had left, and they did not splinter the way wood splinters when it has anything left to resist. They simply gave way, the entire frame punching outward into the night as if it had been waiting for permission, taking the screen with it. The noise was significant. From below me, a voice I did not recognize called out, "He is up there!" I rolled through the opening onto the roof. The A-frame pitch was steep, perhaps 40 degrees, and the shingles were covered in a film of wet moss that offered no traction at all. I came out onto my side and immediately began to slide toward the edge, the backpack against my chest, shifting my center of gravity in the wrong direction. I dug my fingers into the shingles and felt 2 of them crack and give, before I caught myself, my boots hanging over the gutter, with maybe 4 inches of roof between me and open air. To my left and below, the SUV's headlights still burned through the rain, illuminating the front porch. Inside the attic, a flashlight beam swept through the broken louver opening. Lawson Joplin's face appeared in the gap, filling it, and in his right hand, the shape of a suppressed pistol caught the light in a way that removed any remaining uncertainty about how seriously Holden Quillen intended the words he had spoken in the clearing. I let go of the roof. This is the part I cannot explain clearly because it happened faster than explanation operates. I did not decide to push off so much as the edge, and I arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. I shoved to the right with both hands away from the porch and toward the large oak tree growing along the right side of the house, the one whose branches I had registered when I first crossed the clearing, because noting a space you might need to move through quickly becomes instinct when you have been living in uncertainty for 3 weeks. I hit the first branch with my left shoulder, and the impact spun me sideways and down. The second branch caught my right hip and slowed me without stopping me. The third caught the backpack against my chest and folded me forward hard enough to drive the air out of my lungs completely. Then I was falling through open air for a distance that felt longer than it was, and then I was in the ferns. The ground came up through wet vegetation and cold mud. My left ankle folded under me on impact and sent a bolt of pain up my leg that I recognized immediately as a sprain rather than a fracture because the leg held weight when I pushed myself up badly and with significant protest, but it held. From the attic window above, he is on the ground, east side. From the front porch, Holden Quillen's voice clipped and emptied of every trace of warmth that had accompanied every version of it I had ever heard before tonight. Stop him. The bark of the oak tree to my immediate left exploded outward. Then a second impact 3 feet higher and slightly left, which told me the shooter was correcting. I went into the tree line. I want to tell you I ran with purpose and direction. The truth is that for the first 30 seconds, I ran with nothing but the imperative to put as much distance as possible between myself and the man with the suppressed pistol in whatever direction offered the most trees. Wisconsin pine forests at night in October, rain without any artificial light, are not environments that reward directional thinking. I ran into branches. I ran into root systems that reached up through the ground at angles designed to catch a boot in the dark. I ran through standing water that went over my ankle immediately. But I ran. The sounds behind me were organized at first. 2 men with flashlights calling positions to each other in low voices that the forest carried farther than they probably intended. I registered the pattern without stopping. One voice northeast of me, one voice closer and moving south to cut off what they assumed would be my natural path toward the logging road and the car. They were right about it where a person would naturally run, but my father had left a note with Blythe Ellsworth that said, "Do not use the main road if anything goes wrong," and I had been carrying that instruction for hours, and even at a dead run, in a black forest with blood drying on my face, the instruction held. I ran north instead of east, into the deeper woods rather than toward any exit. After 20 minutes, the voices became less coordinated. The terrain was complicating their movement in ways it was not complicating mine because I had nothing to protect, no equipment to keep dry, no professional obligation to maintain communication with a partner. I was just a person running through trees, and the trees did not care what I was running from. After 40 minutes, I could hear nothing behind me at all. The cold was significant. My jacket was not waterproof and had not been waterproof when I bought it, and it was now saturated completely, and the wet fabric against my skin pulled heat from my body with an efficiency that I could feel accelerating. My hands had gone from cold to numb sometime in the second half of the first hour, and I was navigating more by feel than by any reliable sensory information from my fingers. The backpack on my chest was the one thing I did not stop being aware of. I could feel its weight with every footfall, the Wiccan and the gold, and the hard drives and the journal and the real will, but pressing against my sternum like a counterweight to the cold and the dark, and the pain in my ankle that was building steadily beneath the adrenaline. I thought about my father writing in that journal by flashlight in this same forest 7 months ago. Sitting in that farmhouse with the safe bolted into the attic beams above him and the sticky note in his pocket, and the understanding that he was building something he might never see completed. I thought about him writing there are things worth more than another careful month. I did not stop running for over an hour. When I finally stopped, my left ankle made the decision for me, folding in a way that put me down onto one knee in the mud. I stayed there for a moment with one hand on the wet ground and the backpack pressing against my chest and the rain coming through the pine canopy in irregular drops. I was still breathing. The backpack was still on my chest. Those were the 2 facts I checked first. The road appeared roughly 200 yards further on a break in the tree line where the darkness changed quality, becoming more open. I limped the rest of the distance to the asphalt and stood on the shoulder of the county highway in the rain, with blood from a branch cut drying on my left cheek, and nothing in front of me except the fact that I was upright and moving and in possession of everything my father had died to keep safe. The truck's headlights appeared from the south about 8 minutes later. It was a Peterbilt running steady and clean, and it slowed when the driver saw me on the shoulder. The air brakes settled. The passenger door opened from the inside. The man behind the wheel was 60 years old or thereabouts, with the kind of face built by 3.5 decades behind a windshield. He took in my appearance, which I understood was not reassuring, and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Chicago." I said, "Yes." He said, "Get in." His name was Weston Ashford, and he was running a load of manufacturing equipment to a distribution center on the south side. He did not ask me what had happened. He turned the radio to a country station at low volume and drove. About 20 minutes outside of Black River Falls, without looking away from the road, he said, "I have been doing this run since 1989. You see a lot of things on this stretch late at night. Most of them I do not ask about." I looked at the dark road ahead of us. "The ones that stay with me," he continued, still watching the highway, "are the young ones who look like they are carrying something that isn't theirs to carry yet. You know what I mean by that?" I said I did. "The thing about weight," Weston said, "is that it does not get lighter. You just get stronger. Or you don't." He was quiet for a moment. "Sounds to me like you are getting stronger." I didn't answer that, but I held on to it for the rest of the drive. We reached the south side of Chicago as the sky was beginning the transition from black to the deep gray that precedes dawn. Weston pulled to the curb on a street 3 blocks from the Federal Building on West Roosevelt, where I had asked him to stop. He had not asked why. When I opened the door, he said one more thing. "Whatever you are walking in there to do, your father would want you to do it." I looked at him. "You talked in your sleep," he said simply. "Just a little." I got out of the truck. The door closed. The Peterbilt pulled back into traffic and was gone. The Chicago field office of the FBI does not open for general visitors at 7 in the morning, but it does not close either. There is always someone at the security desk, and if you walk in off the street with dried blood on your face and a backpack you are holding with both hands, as if it contains something that cannot be dropped, they will find someone to speak with you. It may take time, but they will find someone. The agent's name was Redmond Gallagher. He was 52 with close-cropped gray hair and the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent enough years in the difficult rooms that they no longer waste anything on gestures without purpose. He looked at me across a table in a small conference room on the 4th floor and said he had 12 minutes before a scheduled call. I put 3 things on the table in front of him: the manila envelope containing the real will in the toxicology report, the hard drive labeled C1, and a copy of the printed email chain from the safe. He looked at each item without touching any of them. Then he looked at me. "Talk," he said. I talked for 11 minutes. I did not editorialize. I did not tell him how I felt about any of it. I gave him the sequence of events in order: the eviction, the tackle box, the bank, the property in Wisconsin, the safe, the destroyed keypad, the hidden mechanical lock, the contents of the checkmate envelope, Lawson Joplin and Holden Quillen in the clearing below the attic window, and the drive south with a truck driver who had not asked a single question. When I finished, Gallagher was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are 19 years old." "Yes." "You drove to Wisconsin alone with no backup and no communication plan, entered a property that was potentially under surveillance, located evidence you had no guarantee existed, and got out while 2 armed men were actively trying to stop you from doing exactly that." I didn't have a lot of other options available to me. He looked at the hard drive on the table. "What is on this?" "I don't know. My father labeled it C1. There is a second one labeled C2 in the bag. He sealed them in the safe with everything else. I have to assume he put them there because they matter." Gallagher picked up his phone and said 4 words to whoever answered, "Get Chen up here." The analyst who arrived 20 minutes later was young and efficient and did not introduce herself before she picked up both hard drives and left. Gallagher told me to sit and wait and that someone would bring coffee, and both of those things happened. I sat in the conference room and drank bad coffee and watched the Chicago morning arrive through the window, the city resolving out of the gray pre-dawn, the way things resolve when you have been awake long enough that the boundary between exhaustion and clarity becomes impossible to locate. 40 minutes later, the analyst returned. She set a laptop on the table and turned it so Gallagher could see the screen. She said 3 sentences to him in a low voice. His expression did not change during the first sentence, shifted slightly during the second, and by the third had settled into something that was not surprise, but was very close to the controlled version of it that experienced agents permit themselves. He looked at me. The first drive contains audio recordings, approximately 9 hours of material. Your father hired a private investigator. The investigator placed recording equipment in locations where your stepmother and Holden Quillen conducted private meetings. We have their voices. We have specific details. I had understood something like this was coming. Understanding it was coming did not prepare me for hearing it stated plainly in a federal building by a man with no reason to soften it. The second drive, Gallagher continued, contains financial records, wire transfers, account numbers that match the emails you retrieved from the safe, transaction histories covering 14 months. He closed the laptop. The nurse's name's Cheryl Voss. We have her receiving payments at 8 specific intervals. We have correspondence between Holden Quillen and a Dr. Philip Crane, who provided prescription authorization under circumstances that will interest the Illinois Medical Board considerably in addition to this office. He paused. We also have communications involving a Lawson Joplin, formerly of a private contracting firm, who appears to have been retained for services that go well beyond legitimate security work. I said, he was in the attic last night with Holden Quillen. Gallagher nodded slowly. I know. We pulled location data from his phone. He hit a cell tower near Black River Falls, Wisconsin at 11:47 last night. He stood up. I need to make some calls. You need to stay in this building. Do you understand? I said I understood. He stopped at the door. Without turning around, he said, your father put 9 hours of audio recordings on an encrypted drive and hid them in a safe that no one could open without a key that was in a safety deposit box that no one could access, without a document that was in a tackle box that no one could find without knowing where to look. He paused. He planned this for a long time. I know, I said. He planned it for you specifically. I know that too. Gallagher left. I sat in the conference room with my coffee going cold and looked out the window at Chicago in the morning and thought about my father sitting in a general store in Black River Falls 7 months ago, leaving an envelope with a woman named Blythe Ellsworth he had just met, trusting that the chain of things he had built would hold long enough for me to find my way through it. It held. The 72 hours I spent inside that building were the strangest of my life, and I have had a genuinely strange life by most measures. They gave me a room with a queen and a private bathroom, which was the first private bathroom I had used in 3 weeks, in which I spent an unreasonably long time in simply standing under hot water. They gave me a change of clothes from an evidence locker navy blue sweatpants and a gray t-shirt that were slightly too large, which felt like the most comfortable thing I had worn since October. They brought me food from a place on the street below, and I ate all of it without tasting any of it. Gallagher came in twice that first day to update me on what the analysts were finding on the hard drives. The 9 hours of audio on C1 were being cataloged and cross-referenced with the email chain from the checkmate envelope. The financial records on C2 were being mapped against publicly available corporate filings for Underwood Track to establish the timeline and scale of what Holden and Audra had planned to do with the company once the estate cleared probate. What they had planned was significant. Holden had been positioning a series of shell entities to absorb Underwood Track's most valuable intellectual property assets through a licensing structure that would have effectively hollowed the company's core value over a 3-year period, channeling the proceeds into offshore accounts that Audra controlled. By the time any board member or shareholder noticed the pattern, the company would have been a husk, and the money would have been in jurisdictions that made recovery functionally impossible. They had been building this plan for 14 months. My father had been dead for 6 of them. I asked Gallagher on the second evening how my father had managed to get the audio recordings made, who the investigator was, how long it had taken. He told me what the records showed. My father had hired a private investigations firm out of Indianapolis 11 months before he died, paying them in cash through a series of transactions that he had structured specifically to avoid triggering financial monitoring associated with his personal accounts. The investigator had placed recording equipment over a 4-month period in 3 locations: Holden's private office, a private dining room at a club where Holden and Audra met regularly, and a car that Audra used for meetings she did not want conducted anywhere with a permanent record. The recordings had begun 6 weeks after my father noticed that his thinking was clearer on the days he forgot to take his medication. He had noticed it written about it in the journal without fully understanding it, and then started paying attention in a way that a man running a $2 billion company for 22 years knows how to pay attention, quietly, systematically, without letting the people he was watching know that he was watching them. He had known what they were doing to him for 5 months before he died. He had spent those 5 months building the case that was now sitting on Redmond Gallagher's desk in hard drives and printed emails in a thick black journal. I sat with that in the small room with the cot and the two large clothes and the cold coffee that someone had brought and forgotten about, and I understood for the first time the full weight of what my father had carried alone in those final months. Not just the physical deterioration, not just the knowledge that the people closest to him were killing him by degrees, but the strategic discipline required to respond to that knowledge by building something methodical and careful and designed to outlast him rather than confronting them and losing the evidence in the process. He had chosen the evidence over the confrontation. He had chosen me over the evidence. On the second night, unable to sleep, I opened the black journal. I did not read it chronologically. I started near the end and worked backward, looking for the entries where the handwriting was steadiest, which meant my father's thinking had been clearest, which meant the medication had been skipped most recently. The entries from his final weeks were the ones I had already read, the careful strategic documentation of what he had discovered and what he was building in response. But as I moved further back into the journal, the entries changed character. They became less strategic and more personal, more like the private record of a man who has built something significant over the course of his life and is beginning to understand that the time for building is coming to an end. He wrote about the company, about decisions he was proud of and decisions he wished he had made differently. He wrote about my mother who had died when I was 11 and about the 3 years between her death and Audra's arrival when he had tried to figure out how to be both a father and a company president and had succeeded at neither as well as he had wanted to. He wrote about me, not in the way you write about someone you are worried about, in the way you write about someone you have watched become something, and the watching has been one of the better things your life contained. I sat on the cot in the FBI safe room reading those entries until the gray pre-dawn light started coming under the door, and then I closed the journal and lay down and slept for 4 hours without dreaming. On the second day, I learned about the complication. Gallagher came in to brief me. Diana's attorneys, who had been informed of her arrest and had immediately begun assembling a defense, filed a motion challenging the validity of the will. Their argument was that Holt Underwood had not been of sound mind when he signed the document. The medication that had been identified as tampered with, they argued, had impaired his cognitive functions sufficiently to invalidate the will's execution. It was, Gallagher told me, not a frivolous argument. In certain circumstances, it might have succeeded. It did not succeed because of the journal. My father had kept detailed entries throughout the final 8 months of his life. The entries were dated, and through the final weeks written in handwriting that grew progressively more unsteady but never illegible, were entries about his medication. Specifically about stopping it. He had suspended his medication for 14 days before signing the will. He wrote about it plainly in the journal. He had noticed that on days he missed doses, his thinking clarified. He had not fully understood why until later, but he had understood enough to stop taking the medication for 2 weeks, to endure whatever his compromised heart would do without the synthetic compound it had been receiving, and to use that window of clarity to sign a will with 3 witnesses and a notary he had driven 40 miles from Lake Forest to find. He had known the risk. He had written about it in the journal in a passage that Gallagher read to me verbatim. My father had written, the doctors would tell me not to do this. They would be right, but there are things worth more than another careful month. The judge reviewed the journal entries, the forensic timeline, and the testimony of Dr. Lorena Langford, who had been my father's original cardiologist before Audra replaced his file with Philip Crane's name. Dr. Langford testified with a precision and a barely contained fury that Gallagher described as the most effective expert witness performance he had seen in 11 years of white-collar prosecution work. Dr. Langford told the court that my father had come to see her privately 6 weeks before his death and had asked her a clinical question: what were the specific risks of suspending cardiac medication for 2 weeks in a patient with his profile? She had told him the risks were serious. He had thanked her, shaken her hand, and left. She had not understood why he was asking until she was sitting in a federal courtroom looking at his journal entries. Audra's attorney made one final attempt during the testimony. He suggested that my father's decision to consult Dr. Langford secretly, rather than through normal channels, was itself evidence of impaired judgment, that a man thinking clearly would not take such a risk. Dr. Langford looked at the attorney for a moment before responding. Then she said, "A man thinking clearly who had discovered that his personal physician had been provided by the person poisoning him would not consult that physician. He would go elsewhere. That is not impaired judgment. That is the opposite of impaired judgment." The courtroom was quiet after that. The motion was denied. The will stood. On the third morning, Gallagher came in and sat down across from me for the first time since the initial conversation and said, "This morning at 6 a.m. we executed simultaneous warrants in 3 locations." He told me what had happened at each one, but first he told me something else. He said, "We offered you the option of being present at the Lake Forest location. The team lead said to ask you directly." I thought about it for a moment, about standing outside that house again, about watching from a car on the street, about what I would feel seeing Audra come out of those doors. I said no. He nodded as if that was the answer he had expected. "I'll tell you what happened." He told me what happened. At the Lake Forest estate, a federal team arrived at 6 o'clock with a warrant and a significant number of agents. Audra Tilford Underwood had been in the master bedroom. She came out in cashmere, which Gallagher noted appeared to be a deliberate choice given the hour, and was placed in handcuffs in the foyer of a house she had spent 5 years acquiring. She said nothing at first. Then she said her attorneys would have the situation resolved within 48 hours. She said it 3 times. The agents did not respond to any of the 3 repetitions. Beckett Tilford had been in the pool house. He was 22 years old and wearing silk pajamas, and he cried in a way that Gallagher described with professional neutrality as sustained and uncontrolled. He was placed in a federal vehicle and driven downtown, and he did not stop crying for most of the ride. At Holden Quillen's law offices on Michigan Avenue, a morning partners meeting was interrupted by 2 agents with a federal arrest warrant. Holden had apparently recognized the situation the moment the agents entered the room and had said nothing after the initial moment of eye contact with the lead agent. He was cuffed at his own conference table. The 4 junior associates and 2 clients present watched from their seats. Lawson Joplin was located at a motel outside of Kenosha. He was asleep. He did not resist. Gallagher set a copy of the arrest documentation on the table in front of me. The charges include first-degree murder, criminal conspiracy, federal wire fraud, and money laundering. The nurse Cheryl Voss has already retained counsel and is cooperating. Dr. Crane has surrendered his license and is expected to cooperate as well. He looked at me directly. Detective Elspeth Merriweather in Black River Falls has been suspended pending a separate investigation into funds received from Holden Quillen across a 14-month period. I looked at the arrest documents. At Audra's name, at Holden's, at the account numbers in the financial exhibits that matched the numbers in the emails I had read on the floor of an attic 2 nights ago. I did not feel what I had expected to feel. I had anticipated something large in releasing the decompression of everything that had been compressed since a deadbolt clicked shut in Lake Forest with me on the wrong side of it. What I felt instead was quieter, more like a long sound finally stopping than a new sound beginning. The stillness of something that has been running for a very long time and has now been turned off. 2 weeks after the warrants, I received an email from an address I did not recognize, routed through an attorney's office. It was from Beckett Tilford. 4 sentences. He wrote that he had not participated in what his mother had done. He wrote that he had known something was wrong and had said nothing, and that he understood the difference between those 2 things and was not asking me to treat them as equivalent. He wrote that he was sorry, not because of what had happened to him as a consequence, because of what had been done to my father and to me. I read the email 4 times. Then I typed 1 paragraph in response. I wrote that I believed him when he said he had not participated. I wrote that knowing something is wrong and remaining silent is its own category of choice, and that he would need to decide what to do with that for the rest of his life, and that navigating that was not my responsibility to manage for him. I wrote that I wished him no harm, and I wrote that he should not contact me again. I sent it and closed the window, and that was the last time I thought about Beckett Tilford for a very long time. The legal process took 6 months. These things always take longer than you expect them to. The probate court reviewed the competing wills, the forensic evidence, the testimony of 3 witnesses, and a notary and a forensic accountant, and 2 FBI analysts and Dr. Lorena Langford. When the court validated the real will and voided Audra's documents, I was sitting in a small office off the main courtroom with Gallagher standing beside me. The clerk came in and confirmed the ruling. Gallagher said nothing. I said nothing. After a moment, he put his hand briefly on my shoulder, simply and without pressure as acknowledgement, and then he removed it and we walked out. I was 20 years old. I owned a logistics software company valued at $2.3 billion, dollars, a lake house in Lake Forest I did not want, and a dilapidated A-frame property in Black River Falls, Wisconsin, that I very much did. The first decision I made as the legal owner of Underwood Track Systems was to call the company's chief engineer, a man named Emmett Whitmore, who had been with my father since the Naperville garage, and who had been systematically pushed to the margins by board members Audra had installed in the months before my father died. I found his number in the contact file my father kept in the journal's inside back cover, a list of perhaps 30 people with a small notation next to each name in my father's handwriting. Next to Emmett Whitmore's number, my father had written 2 words still good. I called him on a Tuesday morning. He answered on the second ring. I told him everything. Not a summary and not a careful version edited for professional purposes. Everything starting with the eviction in the parking lot, in the tackle box, and ending with 72 hours in a federal building and a probate court ruling that had come down 48 hours before. He was quiet for a long time after I finished, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Then he said, I knew something was wrong. 7 months ago, there were changes to the licensing structure that didn't make sense to me from a business standpoint. I raised it with the board. I was told to stay in my lane. He paused. I should have pushed harder. I said, you didn't have what I had. You couldn't have known the full shape of it. I knew enough to know it was wrong, he said. That should have been sufficient. I did not argue with that. I said, you have a decision to make about what to do with it going forward. That decision could start by accepting the interim CEO position if you are willing to take it. He said he needed to think about it. He called back in 4 hours and said yes. Then he said, your father was the best person I have ever worked for. I want you to know that. I said I knew. I thanked him. I hung up and sat in the silence of the apartment I had rented 2 weeks after the ruling, the first apartment I had ever had that was entirely mine, and felt something settle in a way that things had not settled since October. The second decision was to establish a foundation. I called it the Holt Underwood Foundation, which is not a creative name, but it did not seem like an occasion for creativity. The foundation's purpose was to fund independent oversight of pharmaceutical dispensing in private medical settings and to support patients whose care had been compromised by financial conflicts of interest between their providers and third parties. Dr. Lorena Langford agreed to sit on the advisory board. She said she had been waiting for someone to build something like this for most of her career. The third decision was to sell the Lake Forest estate. There was a moment brief where I considered keeping it. It was the house I had grown up in. It held 20 years of mornings and dinners and the sound of my father's voice in the kitchen. It held the driveway lined with oak trees he had planted himself. It also held the sound of a deadbolt clicking shut and the look of my own face reflected in the glass and the weight of what had been done inside those walls to the person I loved most. Some buildings carry what happened in them more than they carry the space itself, and there is no renovation that changes that. I sold it. The proceeds went into the foundation's operating endowment. In the spring, when the construction crew I had hired finished their work, I drove north to Black River Falls for the first time since October. I stopped at Ellsworth's general store on the way through town. Blythe Ellsworth was behind the counter when I came in. She looked at me for a moment, and then she did something I had not expected. She came around from behind the counter, crossed the floor, and put both arms around me without saying anything. She held on for a moment and then stepped back and looked at my face. I read about the verdict, she said. In the Tribune, it was a small item on page 12 which I thought was wrong. Something like that ought to be on the front page. I said the verdict was what mattered, not where it was placed. She went behind the counter and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the glass top between us. I sat down at the table by the window. The table she had told me my father had sat at 7 months before his death. I said, what was he like when he was here? I don't mean what he looked like. I mean, what was he like? Blythe picked up her cup and looked at the window for a moment before answering. Outside, a logging truck was working its way down County Road H in the direction of the logging road 3 miles on. He was quiet, she said. He sat at that table, and he had his coffee, and he looked out the window for a long time without saying much. At one point, he took out a notebook and wrote something in it. When he left, he came to the counter, and he gave me the envelope, and he told me what to do with it, and then he said something I have thought about since. I waited. He said, "My son is going to have a very hard few months, but he will come through it. I just need him to know that I knew that about him." He said it like he was telling me something important, that he needed someone else to hold for a while. She paused. I told him I would hold it, and then he left. I sat with that for a long time. Outside, the logging truck had rounded a bend and disappeared into the pines. "He was right," I said finally. "I know," she said. "You are here, aren't you?" I finished my coffee. I thanked her. I drove the 3 miles up County Road H and then down the logging road to the clearing, and the house looked back at me in the spring morning light like something that had been waiting. The A-frame was unrecognizable from the outside. The new roof was clean, gray asphalt shingle. The siding had been repainted white with dark green trim. The porch roof was level and structurally sound. The driveway into the clearing had been resurfaced and widened. The overgrown oaks had been trimmed back to let light reach the clearing. I walked through every room. The kitchen had new counters and functioning appliances. The bedroom was furnished simply and well. The study where Lawson Joplin had searched through everything on a night in October that felt both very recent and very far away was now a quiet room with good afternoon light and a single oak desk I had chosen because it reminded me of the one in my father's office at Underwood Track. Then I climbed up to the attic. The plywood floor had been sanded and sealed. The rafters had been reinforced. Where the 6-foot safe had stood bolted into the low-bearing beams, there was now an opening between two exposed joists, and the room around it had been converted into a library. Shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls. The 4th wall was almost entirely glass, a new dormer window looking out over the clearing and the pine trees beyond it, and in the late afternoon it threw long bars of light across the sealed plywood floor. I had moved the safe. It stood in the corner of the library with its door open, empty. The keypad housing I had pried off with a folding knife in the dark had been replaced with a clean steel plate, the mechanical keyhole visible just below it. The safe would never hold what it had held, because what it had held was now in the custody of federal prosecutors and Foundation archives in a probate court's permanent record. But the safe itself had been here when nothing else was, and it seemed right to let it remain. I placed 2 things on the top shelf of the library. The green tackle box dented at one corner with the handle still wrapped in black electrical tape that my father had applied in the mid-90s and never replaced. And the black leather journal which the court had returned to me after the proceedings closed as part of my father's personal effects. I had not read all of it. I had read the entries that mattered to the case. But there were 8 months of entries, and most of them were not about Audra or Holden Quillen or the compound that had been substituted for his medication. Most of them were about ordinary things, about the logistics software he was still trying to refine even as his body was failing, about a book he was reading, about the weather on Lake Michigan in early spring, which he had always preferred to summer. About me. I sat on the floor of the library with my back against the wall below the shelves and read those entries in the afternoon light coming through the new dormer window. Outside, the clearing was still, and the pines were moving in a wind I could see through the glass, but could not hear. My father had written in an entry from 8 months before he died about a Saturday on Lake Michigan when I was 14 years old. He described the afternoon carefully, the color of the water, the temperature of the air, the particular stubbornness of a knot in the fishing line that neither of us could get untangled. He wrote that I had given up on the knot after 10 minutes and found a different length of line, and that watching me do that adapt without frustration and simply continue had made him feel something he described as the specific relief of knowing that someone you love will be all right after you are gone. He had written that on a Saturday afternoon, sitting on a dock watching his 14-year-old son cut a tangled line and start fresh rather than waste time trying to force the old one to cooperate. He had known. Not the specific shape of what was coming, not the particular details of what Audra and Holden were constructing around him, but the deeper thing, the thing underneath all of it, that I would be all right, that he did not need to worry about me the way you worry about someone who requires protecting. He needed only to leave me a path and trust that I would find my way through it. I sat with that understanding for a long time. Then I picked up the tackle box and held it in both hands and pressed the latch and felt the bottom tray give with its small familiar click. The false bottom was still there, empty now. Everything that had been hidden beneath it had done precisely what it was built to do. I closed the box and set it back on the shelf. I looked out through the dormer window at the clearing below, at the pine trees in the late afternoon light, at the sky above them, which was for the first time since October, completely clear. My father had told me once on a dock, when I was 14, that the things that matter most are the things people keep at the bottom. He had been talking about a tackle box. He had been talking about something else entirely. I understood both things now. I reached up and turned off the library light and sat for a while longer in the last of the afternoon sun coming through the glass in a house my father had built a path to, in a room that had been a secret and was now only a library, quiet and full of light. Outside, through the dormer window, the clearing was still. The pines held their position against the sky the way pines do in late afternoon, patient and particular, casting long shadows across the ground where wet leaves had given way to new spring growth. My father had sat in a general store 7 months before his death and told a woman he had never met that his son would come through what was coming. He had said it Blythe Ellsworth had told me like someone telling a thing that was simply true, rather than like someone hoping it would be. I thought about that for a while, about the difference between hope and knowledge, about how you arrive at knowing something like that about another person. I thought he had arrived at it on a dock on Lake Michigan, watching a 14-year-old boy cut a tangled line and start fresh without complaint. I sat in the library until the last of the light went off the glass, and then I sat a little longer in the dark. And it was a good kind of dark, the kind that belongs to a place where things have been resolved and the resolution has had time to settle into the walls. Then I got up and went downstairs and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the Wisconsin night come in through the pines. And I thought about my father, and I was grateful, and I let myself be.